Hi, everyone. Welcome to video number 4. We are now getting towards the end of the Ediacaran period, and I wanted to go through this talk that you've seen before, but I just wanted to mention it because I think it's really important. This is one of the major extinctions that led to the Cambrian radiation. And if you recall, I was talking about how the Earth's magnetic field might have affected this extinction. So the question, of course, is do magnetic field reversals lead to extinction and radiation? There's been a number of studies that have been done, beginning as early as the 1960s that tried to tie magnetic field reversals to either extinctions or radiations of fauna. It's important because the Earth's magnetic field provides a protective barrier to the Earth from incoming solar and cosmic radiation, both of which are harmful to DNA, both of which can cause things like skin damage in humans. Of course, you all know about UVB radiation and sunscreen and so forth. So the magnetic field does provide us with some protection from those incoming solar radiation, incoming cosmic radiation. So the question is, if we lose the field, what happens to that protection? And this began, I mentioned this began with some work that I did with colleagues from Russia. This is Misha Bazhinov and his wife Natalia Levashova, and with Ed Landing, who's at the Museum of Natural History in New York City. And so we went to this area, this famous Ediacaran site, and what we discovered there was that the Earth's magnetic field was reversing quite frequently. The Cambrian evolutionary radiation is one of these unique biological events that occurred on the Earth, and it appears it occurred once, and it probably won't occur again. Although there have been major extinctions, we'll talk about the major extinctions in the Devonian, in the end Permian, and the Cretaceous, and of course there's a major extinction going on today caused by humans in large part. But this first big radiation of animals took place in the Cambrian, and you can see here, I'm showing you, this is a very busy slide, but what I want to call your attention to is the diversity here. And this diversity just tells you, in this case, genera, the number of genera that were present on Earth. And you can see prior to the Cambrian, you can see very, very few. They're there, but there's not that many. And then suddenly at about what's called the Tamadian interval of the Cambrian, about 528, 530 million years ago, diversity begins to expand. And you can see it expands quite rapidly. And we go from essentially, 10 to 20 genera to thousands of different genera in the Cambrian. This is so-called Cambrian explosion. A lot of biologists prefer to call it the Cambrian radiation. If we also look at what is happening during this time, we look at the Ediacaran biota, and this is the time period that we're interested in, or we're talking about right now. And you see the Ediacaran biota go extinct right at the Cambrian-Ediacaran boundary. Most of them go extinct. There's a few. We also notice several other big changes in the fossil record, and the first one is that these trace fossils, remember we talked about trace fossils in the last talk, these traces, the behavior of the organisms on the seafloor in the Ediacaran was largely horizontal burrowing. So whatever creatures were around, they were just kind of burrowing within these bacterial mats that existed on the seafloor at the time using horizontal burrows. So they weren't going down into the mat or down into the substrate. They were just horizontal burrows. At about the Cambrian, pre-Cambrian Ediacaran boundary, we suddenly see an increase in vertical burrowing of organisms in the trace fossils. So a very distinct difference in trace fossil behavior, or what we think is behavior of the organism, from horizontal burrowing to vertical burrowing. We also see that in the Ediacaran, there were some skeletons, things like sponges had spicules, they had hard parts. But by and large, most of the organisms in the Ediacaran were lightly biomineralized. There weren't a lot of hard shell organisms. Most of the Ediacaran organisms were soft-bodied. And again, across this Ediacaran-Cambrian boundary, we suddenly see an increase in small shelly fossils, so organisms with hard parts. That's what we see in the biological record. In the ecological record, there is a huge revolution that precedes the biological revolution, the Cambrian, and this has been called the Cambrian substrate revolution. And it's shown here. This is a really nice cartoon of what happened during this transformation in the shallow seafloor beginning around 550 in advance of the Cambrian evolutionary radiation. Recall, the evolutionary radiation took place about 528 million years. This clearing of the ecological space took place about 20 to 25 million years earlier. And what happened? Well, in the Ediacaran, this is the diagram of what the seafloor looked like in the Ediacaran. We had these bacterial mat grounds, and I mentioned to you earlier in the semester, these mat grounds are just basically slime. Slime at the bottom of the ocean, containing lots and lots of bacteria, a unique ecosystem, but it kind of sealed off the substrate below. So all this shallow, probably mostly sand, if you think about a beach, most of the sand was cut off from the surface water, from the water on top of it, by these bacterial slime mats. And then the Ediacaran organisms lived on or sometimes within these slime mats. During this Cambrian substrate revolution, we went from this horizontal burrowing here. We started to see organisms burrow into the substrate, completely destroying this bacterial mat ground ecosystem. It's a big change because now the surface water, which may contain oxygen, it may contain other minerals, can now communicate with the substrate, and that fundamentally changed the substrate and allowed organisms to live within the substrate and sometimes pop out of the substrate. So it became a new ecological region on Earth, and this is a big transformation. Because prior to this, everything looked like this, and after this, suddenly we have communication with the shallow seafloor. So this was important change in ecology. So we have these biological changes coupled with this ecological change, and it's quite likely, and in fact we think that they are coupled to each other. In other words, when the biological changes, biological behavior changed, the substrate had to change with it. So the key points that I want to get across in this Ediacaran extinction talk is to talk about the magnetic field. And I'm going to show you that there was a high magnetic field reversal rate documented in multiple studies. We also have learned that when you have high reversal rate, you tend to have low magnetic field strength. So the magnetic field is weakened, you get high reversals. This Coatlinian crisis, this extinction of the Ediacaran organism, temporally overlaps with the high reversal rate. That means it occurred at the same time. And the Cambrian substrate revolution, which also took place during this time, opened up this new ecological space. So we have all these things going on at about the same time, and what we tried to do in our study was to link all this together into a coherent story. So if we kind of look at this in a cartoon fashion, we have a series of unfortunate or fortunate events where we have this high magnetic reversal rate leading to low magnetic field strength, which results in higher incoming cosmic and solar radiation, which destroys the ozone layer, which results in higher incident ultraviolet B radiation and actually all types of ultraviolet radiation, which then causes higher rates of DNA damage and mutation. And any populations that were around at that time, they really have two choices. Either they can repair or find some way to mitigate this DNA damage and mutation, they go extinct. So things like sessile organisms, organisms unable to move, would likely be more likely to go extinct. The bacterial mat dominance that we see prior to this, that goes extinct, and probably embryonic stages of whatever organisms around. So if you think about the vulnerable, the most vulnerable of the population, that would be the young, and typically those are the embryonic stages in the seafloor. The other thing that could happen is that you adapt, and you either avoid UVB, you can damage that, you can repair the damage that's been done, and some strategies that could be employed, or some favorable characteristics within the population that might help mitigate this UVB radiation would be, of course, the ability to move around. If you had shells, you would be protected from UVB radiation. If you were able to burrow down into the seafloor, you would be able to escape radiation. And if you were just simply able to sense light or daytime, you could also move and migrate away from the light. And it just so happens that eyes and sight also evolved at the end of the Ediacaran into the early Cambrian. So what happens to the Earth's magnetic field when it weakens, or even a normal magnetic field? We have, if we think of the sun being out here, has a solar wind. The solar wind is largely charged particles, in particular protons, charged protons, that come here, and they create a wind, and the wind extends throughout our solar system. But it interacts with the magnetic field, and there's kind of this standoff distance here, or bow shock distance, where the strength of the solar wind is equal to the strength of the magnetic field, and this is where the shield forms in our magnetic field. And then most of those charged particles are then moved away from the Earth, and the Earth is protected by this magnetic shield. Occasionally, some of those particles tend to be concentrated at the poles, at the north and south magnetic poles. And those charged particles, when they enter our atmosphere, they give off light in the form of the aurora australis in the south, or the aurora borealis in the north. They can also cause stripping away of oxygen, but generally when we have a strong magnetic field, the oxygen loss is fairly minimal compared to the amount of oxygen being produced in the atmosphere. So the magnetic field shields us from incoming cosmic radiation. The normal standoff distance, so how far that shield extends sunward from the Earth, is equal to about 10 Earth radii. The radius of the Earth is about 6,000 kilometers. So about 60,000 kilometers towards the sun, we have this protective shield keeping this incoming solar and cosmic radiation away. However, during a reversing field, this shielding is reduced to about 2 Earth radii. So it's about a 5-fold decrease in the strength of the magnetic shield. We also have to think about the sun at that time, because the sun was still evolving, and it turns out that a younger sun creates a more dynamic pressure, meaning it was about 1.3 to 1.5 times higher in the Ediacaran. So this pressure, this wind interacting with the shield, was 1.3 to 1.5 times higher, meaning that very likely that this standoff distance was a little bit lower in the Ediacaran than it is today. Well, what happens when these cosmic particles interact with the atmosphere of the Earth? Well, it turns out that they interact with nitrous oxides, and the net effect, you don't have to worry about the chemical reactions here. The net effect is to get rid of ozone and to get rid of oxygen in the upper atmosphere. So these solar particles do 2 things. They take away our ozone layer, the protection layer that we have from UVB radiation, and they also get rid of oxygen. So it's a combination loss of ozone and oxygen. This is just a little video to show how a typical solar storm interacts with the Earth's magnetic field. I'll start this. The sun is out this distance, and you'll see the magnetic field lines when it starts, and then you'll see a solar storm compress the magnetic shield and interact with the surface. So let me start this. Let me go back here and get this to work. There we go. So here's the solar wind. This is the bow shock region. Now watch how it's compressed when the solar proton event takes place. Boom, there it is. Okay, once that solar storm passes, the magnetic shielding extends back out, and we get our shields back. Okay, I'll show that one more time. Okay, so what is the evidence that we have for these rapid magnetic reversals? And it turns out, I mentioned the study that Misha and Natasha and I conducted in the Ural Mountains in Baltica, where we first documented this hyperactivity. Since that time, there's been work in Siberia, work in China, work in other areas of Russia, all showing this rapid hyperactive reversing magnetic field. So a number of studies have demonstrated that this is indeed the case. Again, this is a fairly complicated graph that I'm showing you. What's important is that every time you see a changing color here, it means the Earth's magnetic field is reversing. So this is the pattern from our study. This is a pattern from some studies in nearby our study. And these are some data from Siberia. So you can see that indeed there are many color changes from black to white or sometimes to red. Red just means it's anomalous direction. That means the field was changing. And what I really want to call your attention to are these minimum rates of reversals. So ours is about 20 reversals per million years. Siberia 15 to 25. The winter coast rates are greater than 10 reversals per million years. And how does that compare to today? Well, the background reversal rate is about 1 reversal for every million years. Here it was 20 to 25 to maybe even 30 or 40 times that rate. So the Earth's magnetic field was hyperactive. If we look at the late Cambrian, the late middle Cambrian reversal record, there's been 2 studies, and these are both interesting. Again, a very complicated diagram, and the details are not as important as 2 observations. One is that the high reversal rate is still taking place in the early Cambrian, 8 to 10 reversals per million years. Then at about 497 million years ago, it becomes more like today. 1 to 2, 2 to 3 reversals per million years. The Earth's magnetic field, the reversal rate slows down. This graph shows the atmospheric oxygen. And what's interesting about this is that right at about 497, when we go from high reversals to low reversals, we get a pulse of oxygen in the atmosphere. And that seems to correspond very well with this idea that when we have a weakened magnetic field, that weakened magnetic field allows ozone and oxygen to be stripped out of the atmosphere and to reduce those levels of both ozone and oxygen. If we then try to figure out, well, what was the strength of the Earth's magnetic field back then, it turns out there are 2 recent studies. These are 2 studies that show that when the shields were down at exactly the time that we see these rapid reversals, the magnetic field strength was the lowest ever measured in Earth history. And so that seems to make a lot of sense with everything else we see, and that therefore at this time our shields were down and incoming solar particles accelerated at ramming speed and were able to cause this environmental damage to the ozone layer, to strip the atmosphere of oxygen, and to sort of wreak havoc on the environment during that interval of time. Now, what happens to organisms? What happens in the shallow seafloor? What sort of environmental effects might a lower ozone layer have on those organisms? And it turns out that UV light can penetrate into shallow waters. If you go sit at a pool, you can go swim all day, you can go snorkel all day. If you don't wear sunscreen, you can still get sunburned even if you're beneath the water for most of the time. But the UV penetration depends on a lot of things. It depends on, obviously, the most important one is how clear the water was. We have no idea how clear or cloudy it was in the Ediacaran. What we do know is that there weren't a lot of land plants, so it was likely, or more likely, that there wasn't a lot of organic material being shed off the land surface into the ocean, causing more cloudiness and causing more organic matter to be dissolved in the seafloor. And so it's likely that the water was clearer at that time. It also turns out it depends on what the subsurface is made of, and there's some evidence that if you have these microbial mats, they somehow amplify UVB effects due to active photosynthesis and oxygen tension. So it turns out that these bacterial mats may actually be worse during times of low ozone and high UVB stress. Some of the biological responses that you can see this is a modern day. These are obviously some modern day examples. Here's a healthy green sea urchin embryo, and here's one has been irradiated with UV radiation. It actually has a puncture through the cell wall. This would be similar to an omphalocele in an infant or something. So this is not a healthy green sea urchin. We can see the behavior of organisms, this diel migration. So during the evening, if we look at phytoplankton in the ocean, we can see that they're mostly concentrated here in the upper waters, and then during the daytime, they move down into deeper waters to escape the light. And then this one's just showing stormy weather, where they're being tossed about, so they really don't have a preference because they have to go where the weather is taking them. But this is called diel migration, where they move during the day, they move down in the water column, and at night they move back up into the water column. Of course, we know about skin cancer and UVB radiation and the damages caused by UVB radiation to human skin. If we look at embryos, for example, these are fish larvae. These are deformations of fish larvae, either in terms of spinal cord deformation or, in this case, body plan deformation. So it's quite clear that UVB radiation is bad, and it's quite clear that it's bad for embryonic stages in particular. Now, the question is, how well do we know how Ediacaran organisms reproduced? And we don't. We're not sure what those Ediacaran organisms really are. There has been a couple of studies, one in particular with a Ediacaran organism called Fractophusis, and they argue that Fractophusis reproduce by budding and by propagules. Propagules are releasing these embryos into the shallow sea and letting them being distributed by the water currents and so forth. So if those propagules, if that's one way of reproducing, they would be released into the shallow water column, they would be moved about, they would be exposed to these higher incidences of UVB radiation and the types of DNA damage that we see in modern organisms. Escape mechanisms, well, I mentioned some of these, that UVB radiation could be diminished by burrowing beneath the mat ground. Shells prevent both desiccation or drying out and UVB damage in the intertidal zone. And this vertical migration that I talked about, the ability to see light and detect light, also allows organisms to undergo diel migration and flight from light. So here's some of these. This is Trypichnus pedum. This is the trace fossil that marks the boundary between the Cambrian and Ediacaran. These are the first vertical burrowing organisms. These are the first abundant small shelly fossils that occur at that Cambrian-Ediacaran boundary. So clearly, these escape mechanisms, whether or not they're related to UVB escape or not, they do develop at exactly the same time as the Earth's magnetic field is weakened. So in summary, just to tie this all together, this story all together, if we look at the Ediacaran early Cambrian boundary, the reversal frequency was unusually high. Coupled with that, paleointensity measurements, paleointensity means how strong was the Earth's magnetic field, they suggest that the magnetic field strength was the lowest ever measured in Earth history. So we have high reversal rate, we have very, very low magnetic field strength, and that left our magnetic shields down, and that would allow high energy ionizing radiation, destruction of the ozone layer, increase in UVB radiation, and probably also oxygen loss. That increased exposure to high energy ionizing radiation and UV rays are biohazards. It's well known. We know it based on present organisms, and we assume that it was the same for ancient organisms as well. And it turns out that if we look at this extinction, it temporally coincides with this high reversal rate, low field strength. So we speculate and argue that these environmental changes resulted in ecosystem changes that kind of revolutionized the Cambrian seafloor, and then that allowed for the subsequent Cambrian radiation that we'll talk about in the next lecture. I'll see you soon.